29 years old and not a single offer remaining. Ravenna's voice rang clearly across the candlelit dining table, while guests pretended to study their wine glasses. I heard even the widow Creighton refused an introduction last month. Imagine that. A widow with 4 children considered herself above our dear Elowin. Soft laughter rippled through the room. Elowin kept her hands folded beneath the table, pressing her fingernails into her palms hard enough to leave marks while the chandelier above scattered golden light across silver platters of untouched roast lamb and honeyed pears. Then Cressida leaned forward with a smile bright enough to blind anyone foolish enough to look directly at it. "Oh, before I forget, sister. Aldous surprised me yesterday with the most extraordinary gift." She lifted her wrist slowly, letting the enormous ruby bracelet catch the candlelight from every possible angle. He commissioned it from a jeweler in Vienna. Apparently the stones alone cost over 3,000 pounds. Several women at the table gasped audibly. Cressida turned her wrist once more, admiring the deep red stones against her pale skin. "Though I suppose fine jewelry requires someone willing to give it. Forgive me, Elowin. That was thoughtless." The apology was louder than the insult. Lord Harland Thorne sat rigidly at the head of the table, watching the exchange without intervening. When a visiting baron glanced toward Elowin with something resembling sympathy, Lord Harland cleared his throat and raised his glass. "To Cressida and Aldous, may their union bring continued distinction to the Thorne name." His gaze swept past Elowin as though her chair stood empty. The dining room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Elowin reached for her water glass, willing her fingers to remain steady while heat crept painfully across her neck and chest. Then she felt something press lightly against her knee beneath the table, a folded piece of paper. She glanced down carefully. A young servant boy she did not recognize had slipped it beside her napkin and disappeared before she could look up. Elowin unfolded the note beneath the tablecloth, her heart suddenly drumming against her ribs. The handwriting was unfamiliar, bold, precise, and written in dark ink across cream-colored paper. "Pretend you are unwell and leave. Now." No signature. No explanation. Elowin's breath caught sharply. She read the words again while conversation resumed above her. Her fingers trembled around the paper. Who had sent this? Why? What danger required her to leave her own family's dining room immediately? Before she could push her chair backward, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the room swung open without warning. Every head turned instantly as a footman's voice carried across the hall with unmistakable authority. Her Grace, the Dowager Duchess Seraphine Aldemark of Greymore. The entire room went still. Ravenna's wineglass froze halfway to her lips. Cressida's smile vanished completely. Lord Harland rose from his chair so quickly that his napkin fell silently to the floor. But before we continue, if you enjoy emotional stories filled with betrayal, heartbreak, jealousy, and powerful redemption, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support the channel, you can use super thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day. Now, let us continue. Nobody remembered when Elowin Thorne stopped being treated as a daughter of the house. It happened gradually, the way wallpaper fades in a room where nobody opens the curtains. One season, she occupied a chair beside her sisters at dinner parties. The next season, her chair moved slightly farther from the center. By the third season, no chair was set for her at all, unless she asked. Briarfield Manor stretched across the Northumberland countryside like a monument to ambition. 40 rooms filled with polished mahogany furniture, hand-painted ceilings depicting Greek mythology, and corridors so long that servants carried candles even during afternoon hours because sunlight never reached the innermost hallways. Lord Harland had inherited the estate from his father and spent 30 years expanding it with almost obsessive determination. Every fireplace was imported Italian marble. Every portrait was commissioned from London's finest painters. Every curtain was stitched from silk purchased through connections Lord Harland referenced constantly during dinner conversation. Inside this enormous house, Elowin moved like a gentle ghost. She woke before her sisters each morning, checked the kitchen preparations with the head cook, reviewed the daily household accounts that Lady Jessamine found tedious, and ensured fresh flowers stood properly in the receiving rooms before any guest arrived. She mended torn linen that servants were too frightened to report damaged. She remembered which visiting ladies preferred chamomile over black tea, and which gentlemen required extra cushions for their carriage-worn backs. Nobody asked her to perform these tasks. She had simply absorbed them over the years as her other roles inside the family quietly disappeared. One gray Tuesday morning, Elowyn carried a basket of freshly cut hydrangeas through the west corridor when Lady Pemberton, the mother of Cressida's fiancé, passed her without pausing. "Girl, please ensure these gloves reach Lady Thorne before luncheon." Lady Pemberton extended a pair of embroidered gloves without looking up from the letter she was reading. Elowyn accepted them politely. "Of course, my lady." Lady Pemberton continued walking. 3 steps later, she turned suddenly, recognition flooding her expression with visible embarrassment. "Oh, Miss Thorne, forgive me. I mistook you entirely." Elowyn smiled warmly enough to erase the awkwardness from the older woman's face. "Please do not trouble yourself. I shall deliver them gladly." She continued down the corridor, carrying flowers meant to decorate rooms where her sisters would entertain guests who would never think to ask where the arrangements came from. That afternoon, while Ravenna discussed imported French perfume with a visiting countess in the drawing room, Elowyn found young Tilda, the scullery maid's daughter, sitting alone on the cold stone steps behind the kitchen, crying quietly over a torn pinafore. The child had snagged it on a nail while carrying firewood, and was terrified the housekeeper would dismiss her mother over the damage. Elowyn sat beside her on the freezing steps, without caring about her own dress pressing against dirty stone. "Let me see it, sweetheart." The tear ran nearly the length of the pocket. Elowyn pulled a small sewing tin from her apron, something she carried constantly for household emergencies, and began stitching the fabric together with careful, even strokes, while Tilda watched with enormous wet eyes. "There. Good as it ever was. Perhaps better." Tilda threw her arms around Elowyn's neck with the fierce gratitude only a frightened child can produce. These were the moments that still made Elowyn feel she existed inside Briarfield Manor. Not the dining room, not the drawing room, not the ballroom, the cold steps behind the kitchen, sitting beside people the rest of the household never bothered to see. The Thorne family reputation had been constructed with the same calculated precision Lord Harland applied to everything he touched. Marriages were investments, daughters were assets. Every social gathering, every church appearance, every carefully worded letter sent to neighboring estates served a single purpose. The Thorne name must always be spoken with respect. Elowyn had become the crack in that perfect surface. At 29, unmarried without prospects, she represented the kind of failure Lord Harland could neither fix nor forgive. He never shouted at her directly. His unkindness arrived through silence and exclusion, which cut far deeper than anger ever could have. During business discussions held inside his study with doors that never closed completely, Elowyn often heard her own worth dismissed, as though she had already left the house permanently. One November evening, she paused outside the study while carrying a tray of warmed cider meant for the gentlemen inside. Lord Harland's voice reached her clearly through the gap between the heavy doors. "Ravenna's match with Viscount Ashwell has strengthened our position considerably, a fine connection that brings honor to the family name." "And your eldest daughter?" a visiting gentleman asked with careful politeness. "Surely she is next to be settled." A brief silence followed. Elowyn stood perfectly still in the corridor, the tray growing heavier in her hands with every passing second. "Some matters are best left unmentioned. We have exhausted every reasonable avenue. At this point, the situation simply is what it is." Lord Harland's voice carried no anger, only the flat finality of a man who had already written his conclusion and saw no reason to revisit it. Elowyn continued walking before the door opened, her footsteps perfectly silent against the carpet. Lady Jessamine's disappointment expressed itself differently. She never excluded Elowyn openly. Instead, she included her with conditions so painful they felt worse than absence. "You must attend Lady Whitford's luncheon tomorrow," she instructed one morning while adjusting pearl earrings before her vanity mirror. However, I would prefer if you sat beside the older women. The younger table will be discussing engagements, and it may feel uncomfortable for everyone involved." "Yes, Mother." Jessamine paused, studying her eldest daughter's reflection behind her in the mirror. Something flickered across her expression. It might have been guilt. It disappeared before Elowen could be certain. "Wear the gray dress. It suits you well enough without drawing unnecessary attention." The gray dress. Always the gray dress. Ravenna wore emerald silk imported from Milan. Cressida wore ivory satin with hand-sewn lace. Elowen wore gray, the color of rain clouds and forgotten rooms and women who had stopped expecting anything bright. Outside the manor walls, society proved even harsher because strangers felt no obligation to disguise their contempt with politeness. During Sunday services at St. Clement's, Elowen sat beside her mother in the family pew, while conversations floated from the rows behind them with no attempt at discretion. Such a pity. She had genuine beauty once. Beauty means nothing without a ring to show for it. I heard even the Miller widower declined an arrangement last spring. Lord Harland must be mortified. One daughter married splendidly, and then that— Elowen stared straight ahead at the altar, while each whispered word landed against her ribs like a small, precise stone. Lady Jessamine's gloved hand tightened almost imperceptibly around her hymnal, but she said nothing. Defending Elowen publicly would mean acknowledging the very problem she preferred to bury beneath silence and gray dresses. The harshness extended even into spaces Elowen once considered safe. The library at Briarfield Manor had been her refuge since childhood. Floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound volumes of poetry, philosophy, botany, and history surrounded a deep window seat overlooking the East Garden where she had spent thousands of quiet hours reading, while rain traced patterns down the glass. One afternoon she entered the library to find Ravenna already seated inside, entertaining Lady Ashwell and two visiting women over afternoon tea. The conversation stopped the moment Elowen appeared. "Oh, do come in," Ravenna said with exaggerated warmth. "We were just discussing how my wedding gown required 6 seamstresses working through the entire month." Then she tilted her head with theatrical sympathy. "Though perhaps wedding discussions bore you by now, sister. You must have heard enough of them over the years without ever participating yourself." The visiting women exchanged quick glances. Lady Ashwell pressed her lips together awkwardly. Elowen stood near the doorway for 3 full seconds, while her expression remained perfectly calm despite the heat rising painfully at the edges of her vision. Then she smiled politely. "I was only looking for a book. Please enjoy your tea." She turned and walked back down the corridor without retrieving anything. That evening, long after supper ended and the household settled into silence, Elowen sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, listening to rain tap against the window. Nettie entered quietly, carrying a cup of warm broth and a folded wool blanket. "You did not eat tonight," the maid said softly, while setting the broth on the bedside table. "I was not hungry." Nettie studied her for a long moment. There was nothing pitying in her expression, only the steady concern of someone who had watched this woman endure more than anyone in the household ever acknowledged. "You deserve people who see you properly, Miss Elowen, not just when they need something carried or mended." Elowen looked down at her hands resting in her lap. For several seconds she could not speak because the kindness in those words pressed against something she had spent years holding carefully shut. "Thank you, Nettie." The maid nodded once, draped the blanket across Elowen's shoulders, and left without another word. Alone again, Elowen wrapped the blanket tightly around herself while the rain continued falling outside. Warmth arrived from a servant, never from the family she shared blood with. The engagement between Ravenna Thorne and Viscount Leonard Ashwell had been announced on a cold February morning, and within hours Briarfield Manor transformed into a controlled frenzy of preparation that would consume the entire estate for weeks. Crates of hothouse roses arrived from nurseries in Kent, packed in damp straw and wooden boxes stamped with London addresses. Bolts of ivory damask and gold-threaded muslin were delivered by drapers who bowed deeply before Lord Harland, while quoting enormous sums without flinching. An army of seamstresses occupied the east parlor, their needles working from dawn until candlelight, constructing Ravenna's wedding gown from pearl-white Duchess satin with a train embroidered in silver thread, so fine it looked like frost spreading across frozen glass. The kitchens ran without pause. Sides of beef hung in the cold larder beside pheasants, hares, and enormous salmon packed in ice brought down from Scotland. The head cook barked orders over bubbling copper pots while the scent of almond cakes, roasted chestnuts, lemon custard, and spiced wine drifted constantly through every corridor of the house. Lady Jessamine directed the overall vision with exacting authority. Lord Harland managed the guest list with political precision, weighing every invitation against its potential benefit to the Thorne family's standing. Ravenna herself drifted through the chaos like visiting royalty, offering opinions on flower colors and tablecloth textures while contributing absolutely nothing to the physical labor surrounding her. That labor fell entirely upon Elowyn. She coordinated deliveries when merchants arrived at inconvenient hours. She resolved arguments between the florist and the housekeeper over which arrangements belonged in which rooms. She personally polished 64 pieces of inherited silverware after discovering tarnish marks the evening before the celebration dinner, sitting alone in the pantry long past midnight, rubbing each fork and knife until her fingers ached. She corrected the seating chart 3 times after Lord Harland changed his mind about which guests deserved proximity to the head table. She calmed a weeping kitchen maid who had burned an entire tray of sugared pastries and was certain she would be dismissed before morning. Not once did anyone acknowledge this work. Not once did the family pause to recognize that every surface they admired had been prepared by the daughter they preferred to forget. Elowyn had become the silent mechanism that kept Briarfield running while the family enjoyed the surfaces she maintained. 3 days before the celebration, Lady Jessamine summoned Elowyn to discuss her dress for the evening. The conversation lasted barely a minute. "Wear something simple. This is Ravenna's occasion. We do not want anyone distracted by unnecessary efforts." Elowyn nodded and chose the gray dress from the back of her wardrobe. It was always the gray dress. By the night of the engagement celebration, exhaustion had settled so deeply behind Elowyn's eyes that even Nettie noticed while helping her fasten her buttons. "You look as though you have not slept in 3 days. Elowyn managed a faint smile in the mirror. Only 2. Nobody thanked her once. The ballroom glittered that evening beneath hundreds of candles suspended in crystal chandeliers. Guests arrived in waves of perfume and silk, filling the room with laughter and conversation, while servants carried enormous silver platters of honey-glazed duck, roasted root vegetables, poached pears drizzled with brandy sauce, buttered asparagus, warm bread rolls, and towering arrangements of aged cheese, grapes, and candied walnuts. Ravenna commanded the entire room in pale gold satin, her dark hair pinned beneath a diamond comb that caught the light whenever she turned her head. Lord Harland stood proudly beside Viscount Ashwell, introducing him to every important guest with the careful enthusiasm of a man presenting a prize thoroughbred at auction. Elowyn stood near the far wall beside the musicians, straightening a flower arrangement that had tilted during the evening. An elderly countess approached her with a kind expression. "You must be one of Lord Harland's daughters. Tell me, dear, are you the next to be engaged?" Before Elowyn could answer, Ravenna's voice carried from behind them with perfect timing. "Oh, Lady Gresham, that is my elder sister. I am afraid the marriage question has become rather delicate where Elowyn is concerned. We have all learned it is best not to ask." Several nearby guests looked away immediately. The Countess pressed her lips together with visible discomfort and excused herself quickly. Elowyn remained standing beside the tilted flowers, her hands clasped tightly together at her waist, while her expression betrayed nothing. Later during supper, while toasts were raised repeatedly to Ravenna and Leonard's future, Ravenna leaned across the table toward Elowyn with a champagne glass balanced elegantly in her fingers. "Honestly, sister, you organized this entire evening beautifully. Perhaps event management is your true calling. Every great household needs someone reliable working behind the scenes." Polite laughter rippled across the table. Lord Harland did not correct her. Lady Jessamine studied the contents of her wine glass as though something fascinating lived at the bottom of it. Elowyn lowered her gaze to her untouched plate and said nothing. There existed no response that would not make things worse, and she had learned long ago that silence was the only armor available to her inside this house. The wedding took place 6 weeks later on a morning so bitterly cold that frost clung to the church windows like white lace painted by an invisible hand. Ravenna walked the aisle wrapped in fur-trimmed satin while organ music echoed between ancient stone pillars. Leonard waited at the altar with the expression of a man completing a necessary and respectable transaction. Even then, standing 2 rows behind her mother, Elowyn noticed something uncertain behind his eyes, a flicker of something that resembled careful obligation rather than joy. But nobody else seemed troubled by what she saw. After the ceremony, guests gathered outside the church doors, throwing dried lavender petals while the couple climbed into a decorated carriage drawn by matching gray horses. Dried petals drifted through the frozen air like tiny prayers offered to a future nobody could guarantee. Elowyn stood near the stone church steps, holding her gloves tightly against the wind. Ravenna never looked back toward the church. Not toward her mother, not toward her father. Not even once toward the elder sister who had spent 6 weeks building the celebration that carried her away. As the carriage wheels disappeared beyond the village lane, Elowyn remained perfectly still, while joy and excitement swirled around her like a river moving past a stone too heavy to carry along. Something inside her tightened quietly. Not jealousy, something worse. The slow and spreading recognition that the family she belonged to was leaving her behind one departure at a time, and nobody considered that worth pausing for. That evening, after the last guests departed and the servants began clearing plates in exhausted silence, Elowyn climbed the stairs alone to her bedroom. She sat on the edge of the mattress in her gray dress and stared at the darkened window. Her reflection stared back, barely visible against the black glass. For the first time, she looked at that reflection and could not remember the last occasion someone had told her she mattered. Long before silence became her permanent companion, Elowyn Thorne had been someone entirely different. At 21, she moved through Briarfield Manor with brightness in her eyes and warmth in every conversation. She played piano in the music room during long summer evenings while the windows stood open, and the scent of honeysuckle drifted through the curtains. She read aloud from novels during afternoon tea with a voice so expressive that even servants paused in the corridor to listen. During dinner parties, she spoke confidently about history and literature, often surprising visiting gentlemen who expected beauty without substance. Laughter came easily then. So did hope. That was before Emmerich Solvane walked through the front doors of Briarfield Manor. Emmerich arrived during autumn carrying 2 leather trunks and a letter of introduction from a university professor Lord Harland occasionally corresponded with. He had been hired to catalog and restore the manor's private library, a collection of nearly 4,000 volumes that had grown disorganized across generations. Unlike the aristocratic gentleman Elowyn usually encountered, Emmerich carried no title, no inherited wealth, and no interest in pretending otherwise. He wore simple coats with ink-stained cuffs. He spoke carefully, listened fully, and treated every person inside the manor, from Lord Harland himself to the boy who swept the stables, with identical, quiet respect. Their first conversation happened by accident. Elowyn entered the library searching for a volume of Keats and found Emmerich balanced on a wooden ladder covered in dust, attempting to decipher faded gold lettering on a cracked leather spine. "That one is Virgil," Elowyn offered from below. "Third shelf. It migrated during my father's reorganization last spring." Emmerich looked down at her with surprise, then smiled. "You know this collection better than the catalog does." "There is no catalog. That is rather the problem you were hired to solve." He laughed, and something inside the room shifted without either of them realizing it. Within weeks, their conversations stretched longer than either intended. They discussed philosophy while walking through the orchards behind the manor, stepping over fallen apples while debating whether happiness required external recognition or only internal peace. They sat together in the glass conservatory on rainy afternoons while Emmerich read passages from obscure botanical texts he had discovered buried between forgotten shelves, and Elowyn sketched wildflowers she planned to press inside her journal. He never once commented on her appearance the way other men did. He asked what she thought about things. He remembered her answers days later and returned with new questions built upon the old ones. For the first time in her life, Elowen felt chosen for who she actually was, rather than what she represented on a guest list. Even Nettie noticed the transformation. "You have started humming again," the maid mentioned one morning while brushing Elowen's hair. "You have not hummed since you were a girl." Elowen blushed so deeply that Nettie laughed aloud. But happiness inside Briarfield Manor existed only with permission, and permission was never granted freely. One October afternoon, Lord Harland returned early from a meeting in town and discovered Elowen and Emmerich walking together through the east garden, their shoulders nearly touching, while Emmerich pointed toward a rare species of climbing ivy growing along the stone wall. Nothing improper had occurred, but proximity itself was enough to ignite Lord Harland's fury. That evening, his voice thundered through the study walls loudly enough for the entire ground floor to hear. "You entered my household as a hired worker and dared to pursue my daughter behind my back." Emmerich stood straight, despite the humiliation pressing down on him from every direction. "I pursued nothing, sir. I simply found someone worth admiring, and she found the same in me. You possess neither title nor fortune. You are nothing." Lord Harland's voice dropped lower, which made it somehow more frightening. "And you will leave this house before morning." Elowen begged. She stood outside the study door, knocking until her knuckles ached, pleading for her father to listen. Lady Jessamine intercepted her in the corridor with both hands gripping Elowen's wrists. "Stop this immediately. You are humiliating yourself. Do you truly believe a man without position could sustain you? Do you want society to laugh at this family?" The next morning arrived wrapped in heavy snow. Elowen found Emmerich standing near the front gate beside a hired carriage. Frost had settled on his coat collar while his breath rose in pale clouds against the gray December sky. His single trunk rested on the frozen gravel beside the carriage wheels. "I will come back for you," he said while holding her shaking hands between his own. "I will find a position abroad. I will build something worthy of standing beside you. No matter how long it takes, I will return." Elowen could not answer because the words she needed were trapped behind the weight pressing against her throat. The carriage pulled away through falling snow until it became a dark shape, dissolving into whiteness. She stood at that gate long after the wheel tracks filled with fresh snowfall and disappeared entirely. Emmerich secured a tutoring position in northern France. His letters arrived weekly at first, then fortnightly, each one filled with careful optimism about the future he was constructing. Elowen read every letter beside the library window where they had first spoken, pressing each page between the covers of the Keats volume he had helped her find. Then, in the coldest week of January, a different letter arrived. It was addressed to Lord Harland, written by a parish official in Calais. Emmerich Sylvain had drowned when a packet boat capsized during a violent winter storm while crossing the channel. There were no survivors. Nettie was the one who told her. Elowen had been arranging dried lavender in a vase beside the drawing-room window when the maid entered quietly with a face that already carried the truth before any words were spoken. The vase slipped from Elowen's fingers and shattered across the wooden floor while lavender scattered in every direction. She locked herself inside her bedroom for 4 days afterward. She refused food. She refused sunlight. She refused every gentle knock from Nettie and every frustrated instruction from Lady Jessamine, demanding she compose herself before the household staff began asking questions. Something essential inside Elowen went dark during those 4 days, and never fully recovered. The young woman who once hummed while brushing her hair and laughed while debating philosophy in autumn orchards quietly disappeared behind a steadiness so careful that most people mistook it for contentment. It was not contentment, it was survival. 2 years passed before the Thorne family found another occasion to celebrate. During those years, Elowen settled deeper into the background of Briarfield Manor, like a portrait hung in a corridor nobody walked through anymore. Then Cressida announced her engagement to Aldous Pemberton, and the entire estate erupted once more. Aldous was the eldest son of a northern industrialist whose factories produced locomotive parts for 3 separate railway companies. His family possessed enormous wealth, but lacked the aristocratic bloodline Lord Harland, valued above nearly everything. However, money had a way of softening Lord Harland's principles when enough of it was offered. The Pemberton fortune would modernize Briarfield's aging infrastructure and finance Lord Harland's ambitions to expand the family's political connections in London. Principals could wait. Cressida returned from London, displaying her engagement ring with the theatrical pride of an actress who had just received a standing ovation. The ruby, surrounded by clusters of small diamonds, caught every available light source in any room she entered, and she made certain her hand was always positioned where light could find it. "He adores me entirely," she announced to the household while seated beside the drawing-room fireplace, surrounded by guests who nodded and smiled with appropriate enthusiasm. "He told me I was the most captivating woman he encountered in 5 seasons of looking." Ravenna, who had returned to Briarfield for an extended visit, smiled beside her wineglass, though the brightness she once carried had dimmed noticeably since her own wedding. Viscount Ashwell had not accompanied her. He rarely did anymore. Twice during the previous month, Elowyn had found Ravenna sitting alone in the drawing room long past midnight, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace with an expression that belonged to someone much older and much more tired than a newly married woman should have been. When Elowyn asked if anything troubled her, Ravenna's smile returned with practiced speed, bright and hollow as a painted lantern. "Everything is wonderful," she answered. "Leonard simply has obligations in London." The word obligations landed with a weight that suggested Ravenna no longer believed in it herself. Within days, preparations consumed the manor once again. Workers arrived carrying wrought iron arches meant for the garden entrance, imported wines from Bordeaux, crates of crystal glasses engraved with intertwined initials, and rolls of deep crimson velvet meant to drape across every banister in the house. The kitchens blazed with heat from ovens running constantly. The smell of roasting venison, simmering plum sauces, freshly baked brioche, cinnamon-dusted apple tarts, and caramelized onion soup filled the house from the cellars to the attic rooms. Lady Jessamine placed even greater responsibility onto Elowyn than before. "You managed Ravenna's celebration so competently. I trust you will ensure Cressida's surpasses it." The words were delivered as a compliment. They landed as a sentence. Elowyn supervised everything. She directed the hanging of new curtains in the ballroom. She negotiated with a temperamental French florist who threatened to abandon the commission after discovering the conservatory lacked sufficient morning sunlight for his gardenias. She resolved a dispute between 2 footmen competing for the privilege of serving the head table. She tested every dish the kitchen produced, making corrections so diplomatically that the head cook never realized he was being managed. She inspected guest bedrooms personally, replacing thin pillows and adding extra blankets to rooms facing the colder north side of the house. Her hands blistered from carrying crates. Her back ached from bending over tablecloths, smoothing creases that nobody except her would ever notice. She slept fewer than 4 hours each night during the final week of preparations while her sisters discussed whether Cressida's wedding gown should feature Belgian lace or English. One afternoon during the final preparations, Elowyn passed through the upstairs corridor carrying a stack of freshly pressed napkins when she overheard voices drifting from Lady Jessamine's private sitting room. The door stood slightly open. "Once Cressida's wedding passes, we must address the situation with Elowyn directly." Lord Harland's voice was flat and deliberate. Lady Jessamine sighed softly. "I have already written to your sister Theodora in Shropshire. The cottage there is modest but adequate. Elowyn could live quietly without attracting further attention." "It would be better for everyone involved," Lord Harland continued. "Visitors have begun asking why she remains here. The Pemberton family made several remarks last month that I found deeply uncomfortable. Our eldest daughter, standing unmarried inside this house, reflects poorly on everything we have built." Elowyn stopped walking. The napkins pressed against her chest while her breathing became shallow and uneven. They were not discussing whether she should visit a relative for the season. They were planning to remove her from Briarfield permanently, tucked away in a distant cottage like furniture that no longer matched the room. She continued forward before anyone noticed her standing there. The engagement celebration arrived on a Friday evening, thick with autumn fog. Lanterns lined the driveway while carriages rolled through the mist carrying guests wrapped in furs and heavy cloaks. Inside, The ballroom blazed with warmth. Enormous arrangements of deep red roses and white lilies stood between marble pillars, while musicians played softly from a raised platform draped in velvet. The dining tables overflowed with platters of peppered roast beef carved at the table, whole-baked trout dressed with fennel and lemon, creamed potatoes topped with chives, glazed carrots arranged in copper dishes, oysters resting on beds of crushed ice, and towering displays of chocolate torte, candied fruit, and marzipan shaped into tiny roses. Cressida glowed in deep burgundy silk beside Aldous, whose broad shoulders and confident laughter filled whatever space Cressida's beauty did not already occupy. Ravenna arrived late and alone. She wore a smile that required visible effort, and twice during the evening Elowyn noticed her refilling her wineglass faster than anyone else at the table. Something behind Ravenna's polished exterior was fracturing quietly, but tonight belonged to Cressida, and nobody was permitted to notice anything else. During supper, Cressida raised her glass with the effortless confidence of someone who had never once doubted whether she deserved attention. "To family," she declared brightly, "especially to those who worked so tirelessly to make tonight possible." She glanced toward Elowyn with a smile that balanced perfectly between gratitude and condescension. "Honestly, Elowyn, if you ever tire of living here, you could find employment managing estates professionally. You truly have a talent for service." Laughter moved across the table. Lord Harland permitted himself a thin smile. Lady Jessamine looked at nothing in particular. Ravenna drank. Then an older gentleman seated near the center of the table, a business associate of Aldous' father, turned toward Elowyn with the innocent curiosity of someone unfamiliar with the family's unspoken rules. "And when shall we celebrate your engagement, Miss Thorne?" Silence struck the table like a sudden frost. Cressida covered her mouth with practiced delicacy. Ravenna stared into her wineglass. Lady Jessamine's smile became something rigid and architectural, designed to hold weight rather than express warmth. Elowyn felt the familiar burning sensation rise across her neck and settle at the edges of her vision. 20 faces waited for her response, while the candles above flickered with complete indifference. She opened her mouth to offer the polite deflection she had rehearsed 100 times across 100 identical moments. But tonight the words would not form. Something inside the mechanism that kept her functioning had finally worn too thin to hold. She placed her napkin beside her plate, stood quietly, and walked out of the ballroom without excusing herself. The night air hit her skin like cold water. Fog pressed against the garden walls while the distant sound of music and conversation continued behind the closed doors as though nothing had changed inside. Because for them, nothing had. Elowyn walked deeper into the darkened garden until the manor lights became blurred shapes behind the mist. Her breathing came in uneven bursts. Tears she had been storing for months finally broke free, rolling silently down her face while her hands pressed against her mouth to prevent any sound from escaping into the night. Then, somewhere beyond the fog, she heard the unmistakable sound of carriage wheels approaching along the gravel drive. Heavy wheels, moving slowly and deliberately through the darkness toward Briarfield Manor. Someone was arriving unannounced, and very late. Across the northern counties of England, the name Aldermark carried the kind of weight that could silence entire rooms before a single word was spoken. The Aldermark estates stretched from the Yorkshire moorlands to the Northumbrian coast, encompassing tenant farms, timber forests, coal interests, and a shipping company whose vessels carried English wool and iron across the Atlantic and returned heavy with American cotton and Caribbean sugar. Politicians requested meetings through intermediaries. Bankers adjusted interest rates when Aldermark investments shifted direction. Even families whose bloodlines reached back centuries further than his own treated the Duke of Greymoor with careful, measured respect. At 35 years old, Duke Cassian Aldermark had become one of the most powerful men in England. He was also one of the loneliest. Greymoor Hall sat perched above black granite cliffs, overlooking the North Sea, its dark stone walls absorbing sunlight rather than reflecting it. The estate resembled something between a manor house and a fortress. Enormous hearths large enough to stand inside dominated every major room. Tall windows looked out across endless gray water while wind howled through corridors that never fully warmed, regardless of how many fires the servants built. Portraits of previous Aldemark dukes lined the main gallery with expressions uniformly severe, as though the family considered seriousness a hereditary obligation. Inside this vast and silent house, Cassian spent most evenings alone in his private study, surrounded by shipping ledgers, parliamentary correspondence, and glasses of whiskey he poured but rarely finished. Invitations from London hostesses accumulated in neat piles across his writing desk, each one ignored with identical disinterest. He attended only the events politics required of him and left the moment courtesy permitted. Some mornings he walked the cliffs alone before dawn while the sea crashed against the rocks below. The cold wind against his face was the only thing that made him feel anything at all most days. Servants at Greymore had learned to read his moods from the weight of his footsteps across the stone floors. Heavy steps meant solitude was required. Quieter steps meant questions might be tolerated. Complete silence from the study meant he had not slept again, and nobody should approach the door until he emerged on his own terms. It had not always been this way. 3 years earlier, London society had celebrated Cassian's courtship of Lady Isolande Fentress as though it were a national event. Isolande possessed the kind of beauty that made other women fall silent when she entered a room. Tall, graceful, and effortlessly composed, she moved through ballrooms as though the music existed only for her footsteps. Society columnists praised the match endlessly. The Aldemark fortune combined with Fentress elegance promised a union worthy of admiration for generations. Cassian believed her. He believed every lingering glance across crowded rooms, every whispered word beside moonlit garden paths, every carefully written letter that arrived smelling of jasmine and sealed with violet wax. He gifted her emeralds that had belonged to his grandmother. He commissioned renovations to the east wing of Greymore Hall specifically to accommodate her preferred style of entertaining. He told his mother, privately and with rare vulnerability, that he had found someone worth trusting completely. The betrayal arrived without warning on a Tuesday evening, inside a ballroom filled with 300 guests. Isolande stood beside a tall Prussian count named von Haldern, whose estates in Brandenburg dwarfed even the Aldemark holdings, and announced calmly before the assembled crowd that she had accepted his proposal of marriage. She expressed gratitude toward Cassian for his generosity during their courtship, then smiled with the steady calm of someone who had rehearsed the moment carefully. The room erupted into whispers so loud they drowned the orchestra. Cassian stood motionless near the far wall, holding a glass of champagne he would never drink, while 300 faces turned toward him waiting for a reaction he refused to give. He set the glass down on the nearest table, adjusted his coat, and walked out of the ballroom without speaking a single word. His butler later told him that the silence he left behind lasted nearly a full minute before anyone dared resume conversation. The humiliation afterward proved worse than the betrayal itself. London drawing rooms dissected every detail for weeks. Had she always intended to leave? Had the Duke been blind? Had Isolande simply calculated that von Haldern's fortune provided greater ambition than Greymore could offer? The answer arrived through a mutual acquaintance months later, delivered with the carelessness of someone sharing gossip rather than delivering a wound. Apparently, Isolande told friends in Berlin that Cassian was comfortable but limited. She wanted someone whose reach extended beyond England. Comfortable. The word burned deeper than any insult because it reduced everything he had offered. His honesty, his trust, his willingness to be vulnerable, into something ordinary and insufficient. He had opened a door inside himself that he kept locked from the rest of the world, and the woman he opened it for had walked through, looked around, and decided the room was too small for her ambitions. After that season, Cassian withdrew from society with a completeness that startled even those who understood his reasons. Women continued pursuing him relentlessly. Ambitious mothers positioned daughters near him at every political dinner and charity function he reluctantly attended. Young women laughed too brightly at his ordinary remarks, complimented his estates with rehearsed enthusiasm, and studied his expressions for any sign of returning interest. He responded to all of them with courtesy so perfectly distant that it left no warmth behind. Many called him cold, others called him proud. Neither word was accurate. Cassian had simply stopped believing that anyone who approached him saw anything beyond the Aldemark name, the Greymore fortune, and the title attached to both. One stormy evening, Dowager Duchess Seraphine Aldemark entered his study without knocking, carrying a tray of roasted chicken, warm bread, and strong black tea. She placed it beside his chair with the particular authority of a woman who had spent decades refusing to be ignored. "You skipped supper again. I was occupied." "You have been occupied for 3 years, Cassian." He continued reading a shipping manifest without looking up. Seraphine studied her son carefully. The sharpness in his jaw, the shadows beneath his eyes, the way he held himself rigid even when no one was watching. She recognized the posture of a man who had confused self-protection with survival. "Isolande was one woman," she said quietly while settling into the chair opposite his desk. "She does not represent every woman alive." Cassian's pen paused briefly against the paper. "She represented every woman willing to stand beside me while measuring whether someone taller might appear." The dowager said nothing for several moments. Wind rattled the study windows while rain streamed down the glass in silver threads. "I worry you will spend your entire life inside this house," she said at last, surrounded by ledgers and silence, and the belief that everyone approaching you wants something you possess rather than something you are. Cassian looked toward the rain-covered windows but offered no response. The wind outside howled against the cliffs, as though the sea itself were trying to argue with him. Seraphine rose slowly from her chair. She paused at the door and spoke without turning. "Your father was not a warm man, Cassian, but he never stopped letting people in entirely. That is the difference between caution and cowardice, and I raised you to know which was which." She closed the door behind her. Cassian stared at the space she had occupied for a long time before returning to his manifest. 2 weeks later, a formal invitation arrived from Lord Harland Thorne, requesting the Duke of Greymore's attendance at a celebration honoring the engagement of his youngest daughter Cressida to Aldous Pemberton. Under ordinary circumstances, Cassian would have ignored it entirely. But Lord Harland held influence among northern industrial investors whose cooperation Cassian needed for an upcoming railway expansion. Refusing could create friction he preferred to avoid. Cassian studied the invitation for a long moment before placing it beside his untouched whiskey glass. "Shall I prepare the carriage for Thursday?" his valet asked carefully from the doorway. "For one evening," Cassian replied without expression. "Nothing more." The night of Cressida's engagement celebration arrived wrapped in heavy fog and biting autumn wind. Cassian's carriage moved through the darkness along narrow country roads, while lantern light from distant farmhouses flickered through the mist like uncertain stars. He leaned against the seat with the resigned expression of a man fulfilling an obligation he had already decided to regret. Inside his chest, nothing resembled anticipation. Only the familiar armor of polite indifference he wore to every gathering he could not avoid. When the carriage reached Briarfield Manor, the estate blazed against the fog like a jewel box forced open. Every window poured golden light into the darkness, while the sound of music and conversation drifted across the gravel drive. Meanwhile, inside the manor, Elowen had returned from the darkened garden. She had pressed her palms against the cold stone wall beside the servants' entrance until her breathing steadied, dried her face with the back of her hand, and walked back inside through the kitchen corridor before anyone important noticed her absence. She could not afford the questions that would follow if she disappeared entirely. Her mother would consider it an act of deliberate embarrassment. Her father would consider it confirmation of everything he already believed. So she returned, straightened the front of her dress, and took her place again near the wall beside the musicians, where the candlelight was dimmest and the chances of further conversation were smallest. Her eyes remained faintly red, but in the golden glow of the ballroom, nobody looked closely enough to notice. The moment Duke Cassian Aldemark entered through the front doors, the atmosphere shifted as though someone had adjusted the temperature of the entire room. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Women straightened their posture with almost military precision. Two mothers physically repositioned their daughters into his line of sight within 30 seconds of his appearance. Lord Harland crossed the ballroom personally, his stride quickening with barely concealed excitement. "Your Grace, what an extraordinary honor. We are deeply grateful for your presence this evening." Cassian shook his hand with practiced warmth that reached nowhere near his eyes. The celebration continued around him with heightened intensity. Young women laughed more musically whenever they sensed his gaze passing near them. Gentlemen discussed political matters with exaggerated confidence, hoping to attract his attention. Even Cressida adjusted her ruby bracelet more frequently, ensuring it caught the candlelight from precisely the angle most likely to draw admiration. Cassian accepted a glass of wine he did not intend to drink, and observed the room with the quiet detachment of someone studying a painting rather than participating in a gathering. Then his attention settled on something near the far corner of the ballroom that did not fit the performance surrounding him. An elderly retired colonel sat alone beside the cold edge of the room, slightly removed from the nearest conversation group. His military medals rested against a coat that had seen better decades, and his weathered hands trembled faintly around a wine glass he had not sipped from in some time. He was speaking, telling some account of a storm he had survived at sea decades earlier, but the two younger men standing nearest to him had already turned their shoulders away, exchanging amused glances between themselves while the old man continued talking to no one. Then Elowen appeared. She crossed the ballroom without hurrying, carrying no drink, wearing no jewelry, and displaying none of the calculated posture that every other woman in the room seemed to have adopted since Cassian's arrival. She sat down in the empty chair beside the elderly colonel, as though it were the most natural seat in the entire ballroom. "You were describing the storm off Finisterre," she said gently. "Please continue. I want to hear what happened after the mainmast cracked." The old man blinked in surprise. His trembling hand steadied against the glass. Then his face opened into an expression of such genuine gratitude that Cassian felt something unexpected shift inside his chest. For nearly 15 minutes, Elowen listened. Not politely, not performatively. She listened, the way someone listens when they believe the person speaking matters entirely. She asked questions that proved she had been paying attention. She laughed at the right moments. She reached over and quietly refilled the old man's wineglass when she noticed it was empty, without interrupting his story. Nobody else in the ballroom noticed any of this. They were too busy performing. Cassian noticed everything. Then another moment arrived that sealed what the first had begun. A young serving girl carrying a tray of crystal champagne glasses stumbled near the edge of the dining table. The tray tilted. 3 glasses slid off and shattered across the polished floor, sending champagne splashing against the hem of a visiting baroness's gown. The baroness stepped backward with sharp annoyance. "Clumsy girl. Do you have any idea what this fabric cost?" The serving girl stood frozen in terror, her face draining of color while the broken glass glittered around her feet. She could not have been older than 15. Her lips moved without producing sound. Before anyone else reacted, Elowen rose from her chair and crossed the space between them. "Please forgive me," she said calmly, addressing the Baroness with a steady voice. "I reached for a glass as she passed and caught the edge of the tray. The fault is entirely mine." The Baroness studied Elowen for a moment, then softened visibly now that the blame had shifted to someone of standing rather than a servant beneath her notice. She brushed her hem and moved away without further complaint. Elowen knelt beside the girl and helped gather the broken glass, speaking quietly enough that only the two of them could hear. "You are not in trouble. Go to the kitchen and take a moment before you return." The girl nodded with enormous, grateful eyes and hurried away through the side corridor. Elowen straightened, brushed her hands against her skirt, and returned to the edge of the room as though nothing remarkable had occurred. Cassian stood near the marble pillar where he had watched the entire scene unfold. Something in his expression had changed. The careful distance he maintained against the world had cracked, and through the crack, something he had not expected to feel again pressed quietly forward. Eventually, the elderly colonel excused himself to rest, patting Elowen's hand twice before rising slowly from his chair. As he passed Cassian near the center of the room, the old man paused and said something remarkable without realizing anyone important was listening. "That young woman is the only genuine person in this entire house. God bless whoever raised her, because it certainly was not the people taking credit for it tonight." Cassian watched the old man shuffle toward the corridor. Then he looked back across the room toward the corner where Eowyn now sat alone, smoothing the fabric of her plain dress with the unconscious habit of someone accustomed to occupying empty chairs. He walked toward her before deciding to. The chair beside her was still warm from the colonel's presence when Cassian sat down. Eowyn looked up with visible surprise, clearly unprepared for the most important guest of the evening to occupy a seat designated for the forgotten. "You listened to him for quite some time," Cassian said quietly. "He had a remarkable story. Most people simply were not patient enough to hear it. Most people in this room are not patient enough for anything that does not benefit them directly." A faint smile crossed her face. "You sound as though you speak from considerable experience, enough to recognize sincerity when I finally encounter it." They spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Eowyn never once mentioned his estates, his title, his influence in Parliament, or any detail that suggested she viewed him as anything other than a man sitting in a chair beside her. She spoke about the library at Briarfield, about the satisfaction of solving small problems that nobody else noticed needed solving, and about how exhausting it felt to spend an entire evening surrounded by people while feeling completely invisible among them. The honesty in her words unsettled Cassian more than any rehearsed charm ever could have, because he recognized the feeling she described. He had lived inside it for 3 years. When he eventually stood to leave, he paused briefly. "Miss Thorne, I hope the people surrounding you will eventually deserve the patience you extend to them." Eowyn looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read, something between surprise and something older and more cautious than surprise. Something that had been disappointed before and remained careful about hoping again. "That is a very kind thing to say, Your Grace." He nodded once and walked toward the entrance without speaking to anyone else. Behind him, the ballroom immediately erupted into whispers that would reach London by morning. Did you see how long he sat with her? The eldest daughter, the unmarried one. He ignored every woman of standing in the room. What could he possibly see in someone like her? Within a fortnight of Cressida's engagement celebration, Duke Cassian Aldemark's carriage began appearing on the gravel drive of Briarfield Manor, with a regularity that made servants exchange knowing glances behind closed doors. By the third visit, the kitchen staff had learned to prepare strong black tea with precisely 1 spoonful of honey the moment hoofbeats were heard approaching the front gates. At first, Lord Harland treated the visits as a business courtesy. Then London newspapers began printing delicate observations about the Duke of Greymoor's unusual interest in a Northumberland household containing an unmarried eldest daughter of declining prospects. The gossip moved through drawing rooms and opera halls with the speed of fire through dry grass. Surely the Duke pities her. No man of his position visits a woman like that without some alternative motive. Perhaps Lord Harland is offering her as part of a business arrangement. How terribly desperate. Inside Briarfield Manor, the transformation proved even more astonishing than the gossip. Lord Harland, who had months earlier discussed shipping his eldest daughter permanently to a cottage in Shropshire, suddenly began seating Eowyn beside him during important dinners. He asked her opinion about household matters in front of guests, nodding thoughtfully at answers he would have ignored entirely 6 weeks prior. He introduced her to visiting businessmen with a warmth so newly manufactured that even the servants noticed its falseness. Lady Jessamine changed most dramatically of all. Packages arrived from London dressmakers almost weekly now. Sage green silk, pale rose satin with delicate beading, a burgundy velvet evening gown with pearl buttons running along the bodice. Eowyn's wardrobe, which had contained nothing but gray cotton and dark blue wool for years, suddenly overflowed with color. "You must present yourself with more care," Jessamine instructed, while adjusting a necklace around Eowyn's throat before an afternoon visit from the Duke. "The gray dress is finished. You understand me." Finished. Eowyn studied her mother's face in the mirror, searching for something genuine beneath the sudden attention. She found only calculation wearing the costume of affection. During one visit, Cassian and Eowyn walked together through the manor gardens while autumn leaves drifted across the gravel paths. Their conversations had deepened over the weeks. He spoke more freely now about the weight of expectation that accompanied his title, and she listened with the same attentive patience she offered everyone. though something warmer had begun to appear beneath her careful restraint whenever his name was mentioned. "You carry this household entirely alone," Cassian observed while they paused beside the stone wall where climbing ivy had once prompted her father's fury. "Yet your family speaks of you as though you contribute nothing." Elowyn was quiet for a moment. "They do not see labor that happens silently. They only notice its absence when something goes wrong." Cassian studied her profile against the gray afternoon sky. "Then, perhaps, they deserve to experience that absence." Elowyn smiled faintly. "That would require me to believe my own comfort mattered more than theirs, and I have never been taught to believe that." Something tightened in Cassian's expression. Not pity, something closer to recognition. Meanwhile, Ravenna and Cressida watched these changes with fury building steadily behind their expressions. Ravenna's marriage had deteriorated beyond disguise. Viscount Ashwell spent increasing weeks away from their home, citing parliamentary obligations that conveniently required overnight stays in London. Twice, Ravenna discovered unfamiliar women's handwriting among his personal letters. Their arguments had grown loud enough that servants at the Ashwell estate began requesting transfers. Ravenna returned to Briarfield more frequently now, her smiles requiring visible effort each time she fastened them into place. Cressida's engagement, meanwhile, revealed unsettling patterns. Aldous Pemberton had begun dictating which gatherings she could attend, which friends she could invite for tea, and which gowns he considered appropriate for public appearances. The charming man who once praised her beauty now corrected her speech during dinners, and questioned her spending with a coldness that left her visibly shaken after every encounter. Yet, she told no one. Admitting doubt would mean admitting her perfect match was something less than perfect. Neither sister examined her own unhappiness, honestly. Instead, they aimed every ounce of resentment directly at Elowyn. "She has manipulated him somehow," Ravenna muttered one afternoon while pouring herself a third glass of wine in the drawing room. "No man of his standing suddenly develops interest in a woman like Elowyn without some form of deception involved." Cressida agreed with the sharpness of someone eager to redirect attention from her own crumbling situation. "She performs vulnerability deliberately. Men like the Duke enjoy believing they are rescuing someone. It makes them feel noble." Their jealousy hardened into coordinated sabotage. Rumors began circulating through society that Elowyn had pursued the Duke aggressively, using false modesty and manufactured helplessness. Ravenna encouraged the gossip privately while maintaining perfect innocence publicly. Cressida went further. She arranged for Lady Isolande Fentress to attend a dinner at Briarfield Manor, knowing the woman still carried public resentment toward anyone occupying Cassian's attention. Isolande arrived wearing sapphire silk and a smile sharpened by 3 years of regret disguised as superiority. Throughout the evening, she positioned herself near Cassian, referencing shared memories with practiced casualness while touching his arm during laughter. She calibrated perfectly. "You seem different lately," Isolande murmured during a quiet moment between courses. "Less guarded than I remember. I wonder what changed." Cassian studied her face with the expressionless patience of a man who had already learned everything he needed to know about the woman standing before him. "What changed," he replied calmly, "is that I learned to distinguish between performance and sincerity. The education was expensive, but permanent." Isolande's smile fractured almost invisibly before she excused herself from the conversation entirely. But the sabotage continued escalating. During a subsequent dinner hosted to honor the Pemberton family alliance, Ravenna and Cressida orchestrated their most calculated public humiliation yet. They invited specific guests known for sharp tongues. They arranged seating to isolate Elowyn near the most critical women in attendance. They prepared remarks designed to expose her unmarried status with maximum embarrassment before the largest possible audience. Cassian learned of the plan hours beforehand. A young kitchen maid named Tilda, the same child whose torn pinafore Elowyn had once repaired on the cold back steps, overheard Cressida rehearsing specific insults with Ravenna in the drawing room and carried word to Nettie, who immediately sent a message to Greymore Hall by the fastest horse available. Cassian read the message inside his study while evening light faded beyond the tall windows. His jaw tightened. He folded the paper carefully, pulled a fresh sheet from his desk, and wrote 7 words in dark ink across cream-colored paper. "Pretend you are unwell and leave. Now." He sealed the note without signature and handed it to his youngest footman with precise instructions. "Deliver this to Miss Thorne personally during dinner. Place it beside her hand beneath the table. Do not let anyone else see." The footman rode hard through the darkening countryside toward Briarfield Manor. But Cassian was not finished. He sent a second message that evening, addressed to Graymore Hall's stables, requesting his own carriage prepared immediately. If the note failed to reach Elowin in time, he intended to walk into that dining room himself. What he did not know was that a third carriage was already moving through the fog toward Briarfield Manor. The Dowager Duchess Seraphine Aldemark had heard from her own household sources that her son had been visiting the Thorne estate with increasing frequency. Nobody had told her why. Nobody needed to. She knew her son well enough to understand that repetition meant significance, and significance meant she needed to see this woman for herself before matters progressed further. Seraphine traveled without announcement or invitation. When her carriage reached the Briarfield gates, the footman at the entrance nearly dropped his lantern in shock. Inside the dining room, Elowin had just unfolded a note beneath the tablecloth. 7 words in unfamiliar handwriting. Her fingers trembled around the paper while her sister's laughter echoed above her. Then the doors opened, and a voice announced the Dowager Duchess of Graymore. And every plan made that evening, by the sisters, by Cassian, and by Seraphine herself, collided in a single breathless moment that none of them had fully anticipated. Dowager Duchess Seraphine Aldemark stood in the doorway of the Briarfield dining room with the composed authority of a woman who had spent 40 years entering rooms that were not expecting her and finding that fact entirely irrelevant. She was smaller than her reputation suggested, silver hair pinned beneath a dark amethyst comb, a traveling coat of charcoal wool trimmed with black fur. Eyes that moved across the room with the unhurried precision of someone cataloging every face, every expression, and every unspoken tension visible between them. Lord Harland recovered first. He crossed the room with a smile assembled so rapidly it nearly fell apart before reaching her. "Your Grace, what an unexpected honor. Had we known you intended to visit, we would certainly have prepared a proper welcome." Seraphine's gaze swept past him without settling. "I require no preparation, Lord Thorne. I came to meet someone." The room went dangerously quiet. Ravenna and Cressida exchanged a glance sharp enough to cut glass. Lady Jessamine gripped her napkin beneath the table. Seraphine walked slowly along the length of the dining table, studying each face she passed. She paused beside Cressida long enough for the younger woman to feel her breathing become shallow. She studied Ravenna with an expression that suggested she had already drawn conclusions she saw no reason to share aloud. Then she stopped directly beside Elowin's chair. Elowin looked up with visible uncertainty, the folded note still pressed between her unsteady fingers beneath the tablecloth. The Dowager studied her for several long seconds. Then something shifted behind Seraphine's careful expression, something warmer than evaluation, something closer to recognition. "You are Elowin." "Yes, Your Grace." Seraphine pulled out the empty chair beside her and sat down without asking permission, as though the seat had been reserved for her all along. "My son described you inadequately," she said calmly, while a servant rushed forward to place a wine glass before her. "He mentioned your kindness, but failed to mention you have your mother's bone structure." She glanced briefly toward Lady Jessamine with an expression impossible to interpret. "Though I suspect you inherited little else from this table." The silence that followed was absolute. Ravenna's face drained of color. Lord Harland opened his mouth, then closed it without producing a sound. Cressida stared at her plate, as though hoping the porcelain might swallow her entirely. Seraphine spent the remainder of the evening seated beside Elowin, asking her quiet questions about the household, the library, and the gardens she tended. Elowin answered nervously at first, then gradually with the honesty that came naturally whenever someone genuinely wanted to listen. The Dowager asked about the flowers arranged throughout the dining room. Elowin admitted she had selected each one personally that morning. Seraphine asked about the menu. Elowin explained, without complaint, that she had supervised the kitchen preparations since dawn. The Dowager said nothing in response to these revelations, but her eyes moved briefly toward Lord Harland and Lady Jessamine with an expression that carried the weight of a verdict delivered without words. After dinner, while guests dispersed into the drawing room for brandy and conversation, Cassian arrived. His carriage had been delayed by fog along the moorland road. He entered the corridor, still wearing his traveling coat, his expression tight with urgency, and stopped abruptly when he saw his mother seated comfortably beside the drawing room fireplace, drinking tea with Elowyn as though they had known each other for years. Seraphine looked up at her son with a calm expression. "You are late. I have been enjoying Miss Thorne's company in your absence. She is considerably better than your letters suggested." Cassian stared at his mother for several seconds. Then something loosened behind his guarded expression. Not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one that anyone at Briarfield had ever seen him produce. Later that evening, after Seraphine retired to a guest room hastily prepared by panicking servants, Cassian found Elowyn standing alone near the darkened garden windows. She was holding the folded note between both hands, pressing it flat against her fingers, as though trying to understand something through touch that words had failed to explain. "You sent this," she said quietly, without turning around. "Yes. You were trying to protect me from whatever my sisters had planned tonight." "Yes." Elowyn turned slowly. Her eyes were red, but her voice remained steady. "Nobody has ever tried to protect me before. Not once in my entire life. People have pitied me. People have managed me. People have hidden me away so I would not embarrass them. But nobody has ever tried to keep me safe simply because they believed I deserved safety." Cassian stood very still in the dim corridor, while those words settled into a place inside him that had been empty for longer than he could remember. Then Elowyn looked down at the note in her hands and asked the question she had been holding back all evening. "Why did you not sign it?" "Because I was not certain you would trust my name yet. I wanted you to trust the intention first." Something broke open quietly behind Elowyn's careful exterior. Not dramatically. Not with the theatrical emotion her sisters might have produced. Just a single tear that she did not bother to wipe away because, for the first time in years, she was standing beside someone who would not judge her for letting it fall. That night, long after Briarfield Manor had gone dark and silent, Cassian sat inside his carriage beneath the light of a single lantern. In his coat pocket, wrapped in soft cloth, rested a diamond ring set with pale sapphires that he had commissioned from a London jeweler 3 weeks earlier. He had told no one about it, not even his mother. He turned the ring slowly between his fingers while fog pressed against the carriage windows. Then he placed it carefully back inside his pocket and spoke quietly to the darkness. "Not yet, but soon." The winter ball at Greymore Hall became the most discussed invitation of the season before a single guest had arrived. The Duke of Greymore had not hosted a formal gathering in over 3 years. The announcement alone sent tremors through London society, and speculation about his motives consumed every drawing-room conversation from Mayfair to Bath. Greymore Hall had been transformed for the occasion. Thousands of white candles lined the grand staircase, their flames reflecting off dark polished wood until the entire entrance corridor glowed like the interior of a cathedral. Enormous arrangements of winter roses, white lilies, and trailing ivy covered every mantelpiece and archway. The ballroom itself stretched nearly 100 feet beneath a vaulted ceiling painted with silver constellations, and the long banquet tables overflowed with roasted venison glazed in blackcurrant sauce, baked salmon dressed with dill and crushed peppercorn, buttered parsnips dusted with nutmeg, warm sourdough bread, towers of imported cheese, crystallized ginger, chocolate torte layered with brandied cream, and champagne poured from bottles so numerous the servants lost count before the first course ended. Every important family in the north received an invitation. So did several from London. Lady Isolande Fentress arrived early, wearing midnight blue velvet and a necklace of white diamonds that rested against her throat like a declaration of war. Ravenna attended with Viscount Ashwell, who had been persuaded to appear publicly beside his wife for the first time in months. Cressida came with Aldous, whose hand rested on her arm with the possessive weight of ownership rather than affection. Lord Harland and Lady Jessamine entered with expressions carefully balanced between pride and anxiety, aware that something significant was happening without understanding precisely what. Elwyn walked into Greymore Hall wearing a gown of deep midnight silver that the Dowager Duchess had personally commissioned from a dressmaker in Edinburgh. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever worn, and she moved through the entrance as though the fabric might dissolve if she breathed too deeply. Seraphine met her at the foot of the grand staircase and took her hand briefly. "You look exactly as you should," the Dowager said quietly. "Like someone who has finally arrived where she belongs." Elwyn could not answer because her throat had tightened beyond the reach of words. The evening progressed with the careful elegance Greymore Hall demanded. Guests danced beneath the painted constellations while musicians played waltzes that echoed between stone walls. Conversations hummed with speculation. Why had the Duke suddenly opened his estate? Was an announcement coming? If so, for whom? Lady Isolande circulated through the ballroom with the confident grace of someone who believed the evening would eventually confirm what she had always suspected. That Cassian would recognize his mistake and return to the kind of woman society expected him to choose. She smiled warmly toward him across the room. He did not smile back. Young, noble women positioned themselves along his path throughout the evening, adjusting gloves and laughing at precise intervals designed to attract attention. Cassian moved through them with courteous indifference, pausing only for the briefest exchanges before continuing onward. Then, as the orchestra completed a waltz and the ballroom settled into a brief, anticipatory silence, Cassian walked toward the center of the room, carrying a small velvet box in his right hand. Every conversation stopped simultaneously. Isolande straightened almost imperceptibly, her chin lifting with practiced confidence. Ravenna gripped her wineglass until her knuckles whitened. Cressida's eyes widened with something between fear and desperate curiosity. Lord Harland leaned forward from his chair, while Lady Jessamine pressed both hands flat against the table. Cassian walked past Isolande without turning his head. He walked past the daughters of earls and barons who had positioned themselves like chess pieces across the ballroom floor. He walked past every woman society had spent years insisting he should choose. Then he stopped directly before Elwyn, who stood near the edge of the room beside a pillar wrapped in winter roses, holding a glass of champagne she had not tasted once. Complete silence swallowed Greymore Hall. Elwyn stared at him while her heart struck against her ribs so violently she was certain the people nearest to her could hear it. The velvet box rested in his hand like a question the entire room had been holding its breath to hear. Cassian opened it slowly. Inside, a diamond ring surrounded by pale sapphires caught the candlelight from the chandeliers above and scattered it in every direction like tiny frozen stars. Then the wealthiest duke in England spoke words that nobody present had anticipated. "Miss Elwyn Thorne," he said, his voice calm and steady and carrying clearly across the silent hall. "I have spent years surrounded by people who measured others by beauty, title, and fortune. I believed those measurements were the only ones that mattered, because everyone I trusted used them against me." Nobody moved. The candles above flickered as though even the flames were listening. "Then I watched you sit beside a forgotten old soldier and listen to his story, when no one else in the room considered him worth noticing. I watched you take blame upon yourself to protect a frightened servant girl from punishment she did not deserve. I watched you carry an entire household on your shoulders without once demanding recognition for the weight." Elwyn's vision blurred as tears gathered and spilled before she could stop them. "You possess something I spent years believing no longer existed," Cassian continued, his voice softening without weakening. "Kindness that asks nothing in return, strength that never announces itself, and a dignity so quiet that only someone paying very careful attention would ever recognize it was there." Across the ballroom, Ravenna's face had gone completely white. Cressida lowered her eyes to the floor. Lady Isolande turned her head slowly toward the nearest exit. Lady Jessamine's hand covered her mouth while something heavy and unmistakable moved across her expression. Cassian stepped closer until barely a foot of candlelit air separated them. "I do not want comfort," he said, referencing words only he and one other person in the room understood. "I want truth. And you are the truest person I have ever known. Elwyn, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" A sound escaped her that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, but something broken open from a place that had been sealed shut for years. Her hands covered her face while tears spilled freely between her fingers. The ballroom waited in absolute silence. Then she nodded. Once. Twice. And then the word came, barely louder than a whisper, but strong enough to carry across the hall. Yes. Applause erupted through Greymore Hall with a force that shook the candle flames. Seraphine pressed a handkerchief against her own eyes while smiling with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had known the answer long before the question was asked. Years passed after that winter night at Greymore Hall, and the world shifted around Eowyn Aldemark in ways she had once been forbidden to imagine. As Duchess of Greymore, Eowyn became quietly beloved across the northern counties, not because of her title but because of the woman who carried it. She visited tenant families during harsh winters, arriving personally with warm blankets, preserved food, and medicines she had learned to prepare from books in the Greymore Library. She remembered the names of every servant in the household, asked after their children during morning rounds, and insisted that staff meals at Greymore Hall contain the same quality of food served at the family table. Workers on the Aldemark estate spoke about her with a warmth usually reserved for people they had known their entire lives, rather than someone who had arrived from outside. She opened the Greymore Gardens to local families during summer months, and established a small lending library inside the estate's former game room, filling shelves with books she selected personally, and replacing worn volumes with quiet regularity. Children from surrounding villages walked the long gravel path to Greymore Hall on Saturday mornings to borrow adventure stories and return them the following week with dog-eared pages and sticky fingerprints that Eowyn never once complained about. Seraphine watched all of this with visible pride. "I told Cassian he described you inadequately," she remarked one afternoon while they shared tea in the conservatory. "He said you were kind. He failed to mention you were extraordinary." Meanwhile, the lives her sisters had once displayed as proof of their superiority collapsed with the slow inevitability of structures built on foundations that were never sound. Ravenna's marriage ended publicly when Viscount Ashwell abandoned her for a young widow in London, leaving behind debts so severe that the Ashwell estate was forced into sale. Ravenna returned to Briarfield Manor with a single trunk and a daughter who barely recognized the house her mother had once left with such triumph. The diamond comb she had worn at her wedding was sold to a pawnbroker in York for a fraction of its original value. Cressida's fate proved darker and quieter. Aldous Pemberton's possessive nature hardened into a coldness so constant that Cressida stopped attending public events entirely. She wrote letters to Lady Jessamine describing headaches and fatigue, but the careful emptiness of her words told a story her pride refused to speak aloud. Eventually, she left the Pemberton household with nothing except the clothes she carried and the ruby bracelet she had once displayed before Eowyn with such theatrical pride. She never wore it again. Lord Harland suffered his own reckoning. Business ventures that had once seemed unshakable faltered after the Aldemark shipping connections he had hoped to secure through Eowyn's marriage were instead directed through competitors who had earned Cassian's trust through honest dealing rather than social maneuvering. Briarfield Manor required repairs Lord Harland could no longer comfortably afford. The painted ceilings began to crack. The imported marble fireplaces chipped. The silk curtains faded in rooms where the windows were no longer opened. Lady Jessamine aged more visibly than her years warranted. The careful poise she had maintained for decades softened into something more fragile and uncertain, as though the structures she had spent her life maintaining had quietly stopped supporting her weight. One gray February afternoon, 3 familiar carriages arrived at the front gates of Greymore Hall. They were smaller than the carriages that had once carried their occupants to celebrations and triumphs. The women who stepped out of them wore coats that had been repaired rather than replaced, and their faces carried exhaustion instead of confidence. Eowyn received them inside the drawing room beside a fire that warmed the entire space evenly. Tea was already prepared. Warm scones with clotted cream and blackberry preserves rested on a silver tray beside the teapot. Ravenna could not meet her sister's eyes for nearly a full minute after sitting down. Cressida stared at her, hands folded tightly in her lap. Lady Jessamine sat very still beside the window, watching snow fall against the glass while something old and unresolved moved painfully behind her expression. Nobody apologized immediately. The words were too large and the silence too heavy. But Elowen poured the tea herself, handed each cup with steady hands, and spoke to her sisters and mother with the same gentle warmth she offered everyone who entered Greymore Hall. Because in the end, the greatest victory was never revenge. It was never the diamond ring or the title or the enormous estate overlooking the sea. It was becoming someone so deeply loved for exactly the qualities others had once considered worthless that the world itself eventually reversed its judgment. And those who had once measured her value by what she lacked were finally left to reckon with the truth they had refused to see. That real worth was never carried in rubies or silk or the approval of crowded ballrooms. It lived quietly inside a woman who mended torn pinafores on cold kitchen steps, who listened to forgotten old soldiers tell stories nobody else wanted to hear, and who never once stopped believing that kindness, offered freely and without expectation, was the strongest thing a human heart could hold.